Okay, let's unpack this. Welcome back to the deep dive. Our mission today is to get inside the mind of Joseph Schumpeter and really understand his take on Alfred Marshall. We're going to try and synthesize the most critical takeaways for you from his amazing essay. So last time, we were deep in the world of Karl Menger and the Austrian school.
Right, the revolutionary.
Exactly. They were these radical thinkers, pushing marginal utility and basically declaring war on the old classical way of thinking about value. It was a real spark.
Huge one.
But today, we're turning to the guy who didn't necessarily start that fire, but he built this incredible intellectual engine that ran on it. We're talking about Alfred Marshall.
From 1842 to 1924.
He's the great synthesizer, the one who managed to take that revolutionary spark of marginalism and somehow fuse it with the classical tradition. He basically defined modern microeconomics for, what, a century?
At least. And that's exactly the right way to frame it. Schumpeter's whole view of Marshall isn't as this, radical inventor.
No.
He's the master coordinator. He's the figure who could look at these warring factions, the old guard and the new revolutionaries, and bring them together.
He builds the big tent.
He builds the big tent.
Mm.
His genius was taking these existing, often totally contradictory ideas and building this cohesive, workable thing he called the Neoclassical synthesis. And maybe more importantly, he created the teachable curriculum that just dominated economic thought from the 1890s on. He stabilized the entire field.
And Schumpeter's first take on Marshall is just fascinating because he kicks it off with this core paradox. It's almost sad, in a way.
It is a little mournful.
He says that in one sense, the specific structure of Marshallian economics has, and I'm quoting here, passed away already. It's been shattered by decades of critiques and new ideas.
True, it's obsolete.
But Schumpeter insists that his influence, his teaching, his whole way of thinking, it just stubbornly resists decay. Why? Why that duality?
Well, I think it really speaks to Marshall's stature as more than just an economist. He was an intellectual embodiment of his entire age. And Schumpeter uses this beautiful analogy. He says, we might have moved past Marshall intellectually, but we still love and admire his work like a Madonna by the Perugino.
Like a piece of art.
Exactly, a piece of art that perfectly captures the thought and feeling of her time. He's saying Marshall's work captured the economic zeitgeist of the late Victorian era so perfectly, so completely.
The consensus, the moral ambition, all of it.
All of it. He wrapped it up so well that his structure is still fundamental. You literally have to learn Marshall to understand what came next, even if what came next was meant to tear him down.
So his work wasn't just a textbook. It was a cultural artifact that reflected something much, much deeper than just, supply and demand curves. Which brings us to the second pillar of Marshall's personality that Schumpeter really highlights, this profound ambition, which wasn't just about abstract theory. It was rooted in a moral imperative.
Absolutely. And you can't understand Marshall's choices without getting this ethical drive. He wasn't just solving intellectual puzzles for fun. Schumpeter is emphatic about this. He was driven by a genuine, generous impulse. He wanted to achieve the great task of alleviating the misery and degradation among the English poor.
Wow.
His entire life's work grew out of what he called ethical speculations.
So he wasn't just doing what we'd now call positive economics. He saw the technical science as a tool, a vehicle that had to serve a bigger social and moral purpose.
Precisely. He was, in his own way, trying to preach the gospel of the noble life. He wanted to prove that this highly technical, difficult science could still be driven by these profound moral objectives, instead of just becoming some detached, cold, intellectual game.
And that motivation, that ethical core, informed everything.
Everything. Why he hid the math, how he structured his synthesis, who he wanted his audience to be. He needed a system that was workable, that was understandable, so that real policymakers and real businessmen could use it to actually improve people's lives.
Okay, so let's pivot from that moral ambition to the analytical output. We have to get into the substance of this synthesis. Schumpeter makes a really interesting distinction between Marshall's own private inner genius and what he actually chose to publish in the Principles of Economics.
Right, and the analytical core of the book, the Principles, is fundamentally a theory of economic statics.
Statics, meaning?
Meaning it's focused on equilibrium, on conditions in a hypothetical stationary economy, or one that's only changing very, very slowly. But Marshall himself, personally, had this deeper subjective originality, often expressed mathematically, that he kept, silent, or in camera, as Schumpeter puts it.
So he was holding back.
He was consciously separating his most profound mathematical insights from what he presented to the public.
Why the secrecy? Was he worried about someone stealing his ideas, or was this more of a strategic play in the economic wars of that time?
It was primarily strategic
Yeah.
and pedagogical. He took a position of what Schumpeter calls armed neutrality in those great intellectual battles.
Well, neutrality, I like that.
Yeah. I mean, on one side, you had the Titans, the English classics, Smith, Ricardo, Mill. For them, value was all about cost, labor, production, the supply side.
The objective side.
Right. And on the other side, you have these new marginalist revolutionaries, Menger, Jevons, Walras, who are shouting that it's all about utility, scarcity, and demand, the subjective side.
And Marshall saw truth in both?
He saw profound truth in both arguments. He couldn't just pick a side. He saw that picking a side was actually the intellectual mistake.
Because the classical guys, they weren't really buying the whole marginal utility thing, were they?
Not at all.
Okay.
They often dismissed it as, a trivial curiosity. They'd say, sure, that explains the price of a piece of cake, but it doesn't explain the big industrial economy. And conversely, the marginalists tended to just wave away the classical focus on costs of production.
So Marshall felt he had to respect his lineage, respect Ricardo and Mill, but also integrate the undeniable power of this new utility theory.
He had to bridge that chasm. And this leads us right to the moment of synthesis that defines the whole neoclassical revolution, the integration of costs and utility.
The famous blades of the scissors analogy.
Exactly. Let's really drill down on this because it sounds so simple now, but it was revolutionary.
It's arguably his single greatest analytical contribution. He successfully blended the classical cost theory, which is all about supply and the expense of making something, with the marginal utility theory, which is all about subjective demand and how much you want that last little bit.
And the breakthrough was to just dissolve the argument over which one determined value.
Right. He just said, stop arguing.
He said definitively that value is determined simultaneously by the interaction of both supply and demand.
It sounds so intuitive to us today. I mean, it's taught in the first week of any econ class, but we have to remember how big a deal this was.
Think about what came before. The classical guys were stuck on this idea that the value of a coat is determined by the labor that went into making it. That's the supply curve. The marginalists were arguing its value is determined by how much a buyer wants that last coat available. That's the demand curve.
And Marshall just puts them together.
He shows that the cost structure gives you the supply curve, the utility structure gives you the demand curve, and the market price, the actual value, is only found where those two curves cross. At equilibrium.
You can't ask whether it's the upper blade of the scissors utility or the lower blade cost that's doing the cutting.
You can't. Both are essential. They have to work together. It's a simple idea with profound consequences.
And by providing this cohesive, workable model, Schumpeter says that simplified Marshallism became a signpost pointing to realization for later economists. It gave them a clear path forward.
It gave them intellectual permission to stop having these endless circular debates about the philosophical basis of value.
And start actually calculating things.
Exactly. And start doing the practical mechanics of price formation. If you're an economist in 1900 and you need to understand the price of steel, you don't have to debate Ricardo versus Menger anymore. You just use Marshall's scissors. You analyze the cost structure of the steel industry and the shifting demand from buyers. That shift in focus is the essence of the neoclassical synthesis.
This synthesis is analytically brilliant, but Schumpeter gives us this fantastic little peek into Marshall's own self-perception through the uncle analogy. It comes from a personal encounter he had.
Oh, it's such a great story.
Let's share it because it really captures this generational shift that was happening. So a young Schumpeter, fresh out of university, visits England in 1907, and he gets to meet the legend Marshall at the breakfast table.
Imagine that. And it's a beautifully revealing exchange. Schumpeter, who is, the energetic, mathematical, progressive future of economics.
Full of big ideas.
Full of big ideas. He recounts telling Marshall all about his ambitious scientific plans. And Marshall's response is so humble, so self-aware. He compares himself to a benevolent old uncle trying to persuade me to desist.
And he sees Schumpeter as an indiscreet lover bent on an adventurous marriage.
Huh, yes. And Schumpeter, with all the confidence of youth, he shoots right back. He says, and this is as it should be. For if there is anything to it, the uncle will preach in vain.
Wow.
It's a perfect microcosm of the whole field at that moment. Marshall is playing the part of the conservative guide. He's trying to preserve the wisdom of the past, cautioning against these reckless theoretical adventures, especially ones that rely too heavily on abstract math.
But he also knows he can't stop progress.
He knows it.
Yeah.
He understands that if Schumpeter's adventurous marriage, this big push toward dynamic, mathematically rigorous economics, is truly valid, then his own caution is futile.
Yeah.
He was resigned to it. And ultimately, he was supportive of the evolution of economic thought, even while he saw himself as the guardian of the previous era.
That story makes me wonder, though. Did that caution, that desire to be the benevolent uncle, maybe hold him back? Was his synthesis maybe a little too anchored to the past, preventing him from fully embracing the dynamic, evolutionary analysis he supposedly believed in?
That is a very, very sharp question, and it really gets to the heart of the critique that came later. Schumpeter definitely implies that Marshall's caution led him to publish a static framework, a snapshot, despite his inner conviction that economics should be an evolutionary science, a moving picture.
So his role as the uncle took precedence.
It did. He prioritized continuity. He prioritized accessibility over making some radical, disruptive theoretical breakthrough. I think at the end of the day, he wanted to train hundreds of competent, practical economists, not just a handful of abstract theorists.
Okay, let's turn to the principles itself, the book. Schumpeter notes it was the fruits of work that extended over more than 20 years. It finally comes out in 1890. I mean, that is an incredible incubation period.
20 years.
Why the delay? Was he just a perfectionist, or was there something deeper going on, some philosophical reason for being so reluctant to publish?
Schumpeter argues that Marshall's reluctance was very deep-seated. He says Marshall always pointed beyond himself and toward lands into which it was not given to him to enter.
Meaning he saw his own work as incomplete.
Yes. He saw his own book as an essentially temporary structure. He was building a foundational text for sure, but it was one that he sincerely hoped his own students would quickly supersede with better, more complete work.
So he saw it as a stepping stone, not the final destination.
Exactly. And that modesty, combined with this constant desire for practical relevance, that's what stretched the process out over decades.
And this idea of a temporary structure leads us right into his most controversial choice, the deliberate suppression of his own mathematical analysis. I mean, this is a choice that shaped how generations of economists were trained.
It was a massively consequential decision. Marshall was, by all accounts, a very strong mathematician. He used calculus constantly in his own private work.
But you wouldn't know it from the book.
Not from the main text. He chose to push all the heavy mathematical analysis out of the main body of the principles. Schumpeter says Marshall never really gave public credit to mathematics, his faithful ally, that helped him get to his biggest breakthroughs.
So where did it go?
It was all relegated to footnotes and appendices, or in many cases just removed entirely.
Was this some kind of, I don't know, scientific self-censorship? Or did he see it as a necessary translation for a broader audience?
Schumpeter doesn't really defend it as ideal scientific practice, but he explains it through Marshall's priorities. And Marshall's rationale was explicitly pedagogical and social. It wasn't analytical.
Okay.
First and most famously, he did not want to frighten the layman. He had this grand ambition that the book should be read by businessmen. He wanted economics to be a practical tool used in the marketplace, not just a theory confined to the university.
He wanted his ideas to actually get out there and do some good.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And the second reason was theoretical caution. He worried deeply about the danger of mathematics running away with us.
What did he mean by that?
He was afraid that if math became the main language of economics, the discipline would lose its connection to real human behavior, to history, to real-world problems. He worried economists would start caring more about the elegance of their models than about whether those models actually described reality.
That is a huge contrast with his contemporary, Leon Walras. For Walras, math was the only pure language of economic theory.
It's the critical methodological split of the era. Walras's work, his Elements of Pure Economics, is this meticulous, comprehensive mathematical fortress. And it became a pillar of pure theory, but Schumpeter describes it as having a tiresome heaviness. It was just inaccessible to almost everyone.
To policymakers, to students.
To almost anyone who wasn't a dedicated mathematical economist. Marshall's principles, on the other hand, achieve much of the same theoretical substance, this integration of the whole system. But he did it with accessible prose and these clear, simple graphs, geometrical illustrations.
So the accessibility was a huge advantage.
It was a massive boon. It meant his synthesis spread through the market and the classroom like wildfire. It was something Walras's abstract work could just never achieve at that time.
So, to be clear, Marshall understood the entire economic universe. He got the idea of general equilibrium, this Copernican system, as Schumpeter calls it, but he deliberately chose to just focus on one planet at a time.
That's the perfect analogy. He fully grasped the interdependence of everything, this whole system where every price and every quantity is connected by mutual counterpoise. He knew, mathematically, it was all one big system.
But he resisted modeling it that way.
He consciously chose to focus on what's called partial or particular analysis.
Mm.
He broke the system down into manageable pieces. His method was to isolate one small part of the puzzle, say a single industry or a single market, and analyze it in depth, while assuming that the impact of this one small market on the rest of the economy was basically zero.
And that's the origin of that classic economic assumption, ceteris paribus, all other things being equal.
It is. That's the Marshallian method right there. And the immediate advantage of assuming this smallness was that it got you immediate practical results.
Right.
While Walras was trying to build this grand, theoretically complete model of everything, Marshall was developing handy tools that you could actually use for problem solving. If you need policy advice on the cotton industry, you can't wait for a general equilibrium model to solve.
That's too complex, too slow.
Exactly. Marshall's method let an economist quickly isolate the supply and demand curves for cotton, hold the rest of the world constant, and figure out the immediate effects of, say, a tax or a price change. It was essential for his moral mission of practical problem solving.
So it's a trade-off. He's trading some theoretical rigor for practical utility, but Schumpeter must argue that this was more than just a convenient shortcut.
He argues it was a necessary stage of development. You couldn't teach the entire hugely complex Copernican system to every undergraduate. You couldn't use it to inform every little piece of policy. You needed focused, practical methods to break down real-world problems into something you could actually solve.
And Marshall provided that framework.
He did. His partial equilibrium analysis became the immediate context for basically all applied microeconomics for the next 50 years.
Let's talk about that arsenal of concepts then, the Marshallian toolkit. Schumpeter says Marshall devised those handy tools that are still the core vocabulary of microeconomics today. It's actually astonishing how many of these foundational ideas either came from him or were perfected by him.
It's a truly incredible legacy. He took concepts that were kind of floating around, often hidden in other people's work, and he refined them, he gave them clear names, and he systematically integrated them into this single coherent teaching structure.
So let's run through the list that Schumpeter pulls out. The principle of substitution, elasticity, consumer surplus, quasi-rent, internal and external economies, the representative firm, prime and supplementary cost. And the big one, the distinction between the long run and the short run.
Right. And we can't just list them. We need to see why they were so important.
Let's start with that one then, the long run and the short run. Schumpeter seems to think this simple conceptual split taught the discipline a lesson about time that changed everything.
It really did. Marshall used this distinction over and over again, and Schumpeter points out that by doing so, Marshall taught us a lesson from which our generation was and is eager to profit.
And the lesson was?
The lesson was about time accretion, about understanding that the economic outcome of any decision or any policy depends entirely on the time horizon you're looking at.
Okay, unpack that.
Well, in the short run, some things are fixed. Your capital, like your factory building, is fixed. You can't just build a new one tomorrow. So you can only change your variable inputs, like hiring more workers. But in the long run, everything is variable. You can build a new factory, you can invent new technology.
So a policy that looks like a great idea today might actually be a disaster in 5 years, because the factors that are fixed now will eventually change in response to it.
Precisely. And this focus on the different dynamics of time eventually gave birth to a whole branch of economics that Schumpeter calls short-time analysis. It became vital for understanding business cycles for macroeconomics. It forced economists to start thinking dynamically, even when they were using Marshall's static models.
And the engine that moves the economy from the short run to the long run in his system is the principle of substitution.
Yes, exactly. It's the constant search for better or cheaper ways to do things. This principle is absolutely fundamental to the Marshallian structure. If the price of labor goes up, a firm will try to substitute capital by a new machine. If one raw material becomes scarce, The firm substitutes another.
So that's how the system adjusts over time.
It's the key mechanism. It links his static equilibrium snapshots across different time periods. It shows how competition drives the system toward a new, long-run equilibrium. And Schumpeter points this out as a key difference between Marshall's framework and the more abstract, simultaneous optimization view you get from Walras.
Okay, next up, the universal tool, elasticity. It is the standard measure of responsiveness in markets today. Did Marshall just invent this out of thin air?
Well, the basic ideal was kind of implicit in some earlier work, but Marshall's the one who refined it, gave it the name, and formalized its measurement, the elasticity coefficient. He made it a universally usable tool.
And Schumpeter says it did more than that. It created a whole new fashion of reasoning.
It did. Because once economists had this metric, they suddenly realized the power of quantifying the responsiveness of one thing to another.
You could go beyond just saying, if the price goes up, demand falls.
Right. Now, you could make quantitative, actionable statements like, if the price of coffee goes up by 10%, demand for it falls by only 2%, so demand is inelastic.
And that has huge implications for business and for policy.
Huge. And this conceptual breakthrough resulted in, as Schumpeter puts it, nearly a dozen elasticity concepts now in use. You've got income elasticity, cross-price elasticity, supply elasticity. It just exploded. It was a key step in transforming economics into a science capable of precise numerical analysis.
Let's quickly touch on a couple of his more technical tools that you still see in advanced micro, like quasi-rent and the representative firm. What are those, and why did he need them?
Okay, so the representative firm is a really brilliant theoretical shortcut. Marshall knew that the real world wasn't full of identical, perfectly efficient firms like the simple textbook models assumed.
Right, some are better run than others.
Exactly. So he invented the representative firm. It's this hypothetical firm of average skill and average luck, and he used it as the benchmark to measure the long-run costs of an entire industry. It let him study industrial evolution without getting stuck in the oversimplified model of perfect competition.
And quasi-rent, it sounds complicated.
It's basically temporary profit. So classical rent is the return to a fixed factor, like land. Quasi-rent is the temporary extra payment that a factor of production like a specialized machine or a uniquely skilled worker earns in the short run, because its supply is temporarily fixed.
But it's temporary.
It's temporary. But once the long run arrives, the supply can adjust. More machines can be built, more people can be trained, and that quasi-rent disappears. It just becomes a normal return on investment. It was his clever way of linking his short-run framework, with its fixed capacity, to his long-run framework, where capacity is variable.
It sounds like his models were actually incredibly rich and flexible. They could account for temporary monopoly profits for industrial change.
They were. And that richness, Schumpeter argues, is what makes Marshall the father of a later, very critical movement, the theory of imperfect competition.
That's fascinating. So he gave his critics the tools to critique him.
In a way, yes. Schumpeter says Marshall is still more obviously the father of the theory of imperfect competition. This is the theory that deals with the real world, where most firms aren't perfect competitors or pure monopolies. They have some market power.
And the groundwork for this was in Marshall's analysis of internal and external economies.
Exactly. Internal economies are the cost advantages a single firm gets as it gets bigger, like getting discounts for buying in bulk.
Okay.
External economies are cost advantages that the whole industry gets as it grows in one place, like a pool of skilled labor or specialized suppliers. Think of Silicon Valley. Marshall showed that these internal economies, especially, tend to push firms to grow larger and gain market power, which completely undermines the assumptions of perfect competition. And this whole line of thinking was picked up in the 1920s and 30s by people like Piero Sraffa, who explicitly used Marshall's own work to launch the theory of imperfect competition.
It sounds like his work was so foundational that you had to dig into his texts to find the very ammunition you needed to move beyond him.
That's the mark of a true master synthesizer. But we do have to come back to that tension that Schumpeter identified. Marshall struggled with time and evolution.
Right. He hated the idea of a stationary economy. He believed economics should be an evolutionary science.
He did. He said it himself. But the output, the book itself, was static. The principles gives us these perfect, clear snapshots of equilibrium. It doesn't give us the video of how the system changes.
And he knew that was a weakness.
He admitted he struggled with it. He couldn't figure out how to incorporate the truly long-run, dynamic, messy processes of institutional change and evolution into a clean, teachable theory. So since he couldn't model it to his satisfaction, He ultimately presented a primarily static system.
And that became his primary vulnerability.
It did. Schumpeter points out that this neglect of the evolutionary aspect became the main line of attack for his critics in the next generation, especially the ones who were really interested in business cycles and industrial dynamics.
So if his analytical system was, in Schumpeter's words, an essentially temporary structure, what was it that truly guaranteed his immortality? It seems to come back to his role as a teacher.
It's his sheer force as the dominant teacher. Marshall's influence lasted for an indefinite time, not just because of the ideas themselves, but because of the strength of the inheritance he passed down through Cambridge. His students became the next generation of intellectual giants.
Schumpeter gives him the highest possible marks on that front.
The highest. He says Marshall's work assures immortality because it led directly to the work of this incredible roster of brilliant minds who basically defined 20th century economics.
People like Pigou, Robertson.
And most monumentally, John Maynard Keynes. Schumpeter says that for 30 years after 1890, the entire body of economic literature was just guided by the spirit, the method, and the vocabulary of Alfred Marshall.
So the power of his methodology was so great that even when his students, and Keynes is the perfect example, rebelled against parts of his theory, they were still using his tools and talking his language.
That is the definition of a successful intellectual revolution, when even your dissenters have to use your framework to argue with you.
And his influence went beyond just pure theory at Cambridge. Schumpeter makes this other point that seems really counterintuitive. He says Marshall was a huge influence on the emergence of modern econometrics.
I know, it sounds like a complete contradiction, doesn't it?
It does. How can the man who famously suppressed all the math be the father of quantitative, data-driven economic science?
It's a paradox, but you can solve it by looking at his overall purpose. Schumpeter explicitly compares the scope of Marshall's principles to Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, but he points out that Marshall was the one who explicitly paved the way for economics to become not only qualitative, but numerical.
So he had the vision for it, even if he didn't put it in the textbook.
He had the intellectual vision to understand that to really advance the field and to achieve his moral goal of helping the poor, you had to move toward rigorous statistical analysis. You needed empirical testing.
So his decision to hide the math was about making it accessible for the general reader, but his entire intellectual framework was demanding quantitative analysis from his students and future researchers.
Precisely. He knew that just making qualitative arguments about supply and demand wasn't enough. You needed to know how much demand changed when the price went up. You needed the numbers. He was one of the first to really get that quantitative methods are the only possible ones for moving economics beyond the philosophical stage.
So his tools, like elasticity, gave them the concepts they needed to start measuring. He gave them the mandate and the language to measure the economy. His precise definitions of cost, rent, and especially elasticity, provided the essential theoretical scaffolding for the next generation to start doing their rigorous statistical work.
So this deep dive, really guided by Schumpeter's perspective, gives us a much richer picture of Alfred Marshall. He wasn't the dazzling revolutionary, he wasn't Menger, he was the unparalleled master of integration.
His enduring brilliance was in his ability to synthesize, to take these radically conflicting ideas, classical cost theory on one side, marginal utility on the other, and weave them into this single, cohesive, and most importantly, teachable neoclassical framework.
And he did it all while practicing this deliberate self-restraint, hiding the complex math that did the heavy lifting, all to make sure the ideas were accessible and politically relevant. And we really can't overstate the legacy of his language. I mean, elasticity, consumer surplus, the short and long run, quasi-rent, these aren't just historical terms. They're the bedrock conceptual tools that still form the vocabulary of microeconomics all over the world. His work was the foundation stone for the entire neoclassical age. And just to tie it all back to where we started, Schumpeter reminds us that this incredible fusion of analytical rigor was, for Marshall, always tied to his profound commitment to the gospel of the noble life.
Right.
He proved that high scientific achievement could, and maybe should, still be driven by moral and social goals. He grounded the abstract science in concrete human welfare.
Which leaves us with Schumpeter's final and I think really provocative observation about Marshall's self-imposed limits. Marshall, the great synthesizer, explicitly feared the danger of mathematics running away with us. He thought that prioritizing these abstract mathematical models would damage the discipline by cutting it off from history, from ethics, from practical reality. So, if Marshall, writing in the late 19th century, already saw that danger on the horizon, it makes you wonder, right? What would he think of economics education and research today? Has the discipline, which now often demands a graduate-level command of incredibly complex mathematics, allowed that mathematical tail to start wagging the economic dog? Has it lost touch with some of those nuanced historical and ethical concerns he held so dear? Something for you to think about as we continue our own deep dives into the economists who shaped our world.